Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we turn the page here to the NBA offseason. We got some news earlier this morning that the Detroit Pistons have decided to fire their head coach Monty Williams after just one season. Now, this was coming off of a disastrous year where the Pistons were just 14-68, and I can understand to some degree the overall coaching job from the Pistons and from Monty Williams was really bad. But the fact that the Pistons basically swayed him out of taking the season off last year, he was prepared to sit for the 2023-24 year to spend some time with his wife. He had just gotten a $20 million buyout from the Phoenix Suns after being fired there, and the Pistons made it a point to go out and get him. They give him a 6-year, $78.5 million deal, which was the highest paid coaching contract in the NBA at the time that he signed there. And now just a year later, they are firing him and still owe him about $65 million. So, this past year, like I mentioned, it was miserable for them. I have been a defender to some degree of, I think that there is legitimate talent on this Pistons team. And obviously the record was abysmal this year, but there are some legitimate cornerstones to sort of build around. And I think that they should have been better than they were this year, especially down the second half of the year. It felt like they could have been competitive in a number of these games, but ultimately, from the point where they were starting Killian Hayes over Jaden Ivey for a bit there, and maybe some Pistons fans will defend that decision and say it was a little bit of the wake-up call that Jaden Ivey needed in terms of buying in on the defensive side of the floor. But I don't know. It was pretty messy there in Detroit, and ultimately, I'm just surprised at the timing of them pulling the trigger here to fire Monty Williams, where, it's so late in the offseason in terms of their season ended a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, and now they decide to go through with this, and when a number of the head coaching candidates have already been scooped up by other teams. Now, it's clear that, it sounds like this decision came from an ownership perspective. They just cleaned house, signed a new president of basketball operations, so they're looking for this fresh start headed into next year. But again, just very interesting, the timing of this after the NBA Finals, where you haven't been playing basketball since whatever it is, early April, something like that. So ultimately, Monty Williams is out. Obviously, this just happened this morning as well, so we don't have a ton of details surrounding who the next top candidates are. Vincent Goodwell of Yahoo Sports did report that the Pistons are going to strongly consider James Borrego to replace Monty Williams. Feels like Borrego is a lock to be a head coach somewhere next season. The Lakers and the Cavs have also had some interest in him, so I think that one of those places are ultimately going to take him in. I want to sort of dive into the conversation in terms of the quality of jobs in these three destinations, but before we do so, some other names that could be thrown out in the head coaching search for the Detroit Pistons. Mike Inori has been a very popular candidate since he sort of took on a bigger role with the Timberwolves during the playoffs this year. Stepping in for Chris Finch, was the lead assistant for a team that just made the Western Conference Finals, so always going to be some level of buzz there. Sean Sweeney is a name that hasn't been very popular, it feels like, in a lot of these searches for the Lakers and for the Cavaliers, but the lead assistant for the Dallas Mavericks this past year, and he was actually a little bit of a familiar face for the Pistons, where he was in Detroit for 3 years under Dwayne Casey a number of years ago as one of the assistants there, so at least a familiar face to some degree. Sweeney would be. And Chris Quinn is another name that one of it seems like he is going to eventually be a head coach in the NBA, one of the top coaches under Eric Spoelstra. He interviewed for the Pistons last year before they ultimately went heavily after Monty Williams. So not sure whether or not they revisit that. Obviously, they interviewed him just a year ago. What is going to change in their eyes, but at least something to consider. And then one other name that I haven't really heard much buzz about, but I think that Sam Cassell would be a good candidate. Nobody has really given him the time of day just yet, but a former player. He's been coaching since 2009, so what's that, something like 15 years now that he's been an assistant coach. He's currently with the Celtics. Now, he was sort of the third option to some degree in the coaching tree in Boston this past year, where Charles Lee was the number 2. He just got hired by the Charlotte Hornets to take over as their head coach next season. So I would imagine that Cassell is probably going to replace Lee in that aspect. And maybe it's next offseason that he ends up generating some more attention in terms of being a head coach. But we'll see. Again, sort of just speculating here because it is very recent news and we don't necessarily have all the answers as to who the Pistons are looking at just yet. But coming back to this idea of ranking the head coach jobs that are available in the NBA right now between the Cavaliers, the Pistons, and the Lakers, that the three I just put it, that is how I would order them. Cleveland, Detroit, LA. Now, based off of the talent on the roster alone and the long-term upside of potentially being able to build something, I really do love the building blocks that the Pistons currently have. I'm a very big believer in Cade Cunningham, and I do think that both Jaden Ivey and Jalen Duren are potential cornerstones as well. That would be a guard, a forward, and a center to build around. Cade, you can even say, is a little bit of a guard himself to some degree, where he's a little bit of this, modern point forward type build. But again, having sort of size-wise at least, one of each already. They just drafted Osar Thompson as well, 5th overall last year. If he can develop some type of a threatening shot, he could be a real contributor for this team as well. Does a lot of stuff along the margins, the rebounding, the defense, that would help to build a culture in my eyes. And, having those four for being a 14-win team last season, it's a very solid core in my opinion. The issue with the job, though, is the ownership, which is a very large concern. The way that we just saw them sort of lure Monty Williams in last offseason just to give him all this money and fire him a year later. And I think it goes beyond just that. I mean, you look at the way that they have handled from a basketball operations standpoint, some of the contracts, the Marvin Bagley one in particular wasn't great. And the fact that, I mean, for whatever it's worth, I don't know if there was much else on the table, but kind of got nothing out of Bogdanovich and Alec Burks from this past offseason. Who knows, maybe from this past trade deadline. Quentin Grimes, maybe he ends up being something. Malachi Flynn dropped 50 points, I think it was, late in the season. But, overall, I don't think that they just haven't been. It's not even an I think thing. They have been very mediocre to bad for the majority of, since the early 2010s. They made the playoffs that one year with Blake Griffin. So the instability outside of the roster would be my number one concern. But honestly, if I'm a coach trying to, establish long-term success, I do think that the Pistons can be a team you're likely going to have a little bit more of a longer leash. I know Monty was just fired, but I think that the Pistons' approach last year was to try and go all in and make this team. They feel like they're due for a jump, sort of like Oklahoma City was, or maybe even Orlando was. But it's going to require a little bit more patience. You would hope that the ownership group understands that, but we don't know if they do yet. So I have them at number 2 behind the Cavaliers. I think that the Cavs are still going to have to make a trade, so I don't know if the roster you're going to inherit when you take on this job is going to be consistent for years to come. They have 4 all-star worthy, all-star caliber players in Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, and Jarrett Allen. Garland and Allen have made all-star games in the past. Mobley showed possibly the most amount of offensive upside he ever has in his career, at least on the biggest stage that he's played on so far, with his postseason performance during the playoffs, specifically after Jarrett Allen was injured, I should say. Like I mentioned, I think that they do have to make a deal a little bit, but either way, they have assets, and we'll see what happens with Donovan Mitchell, whether he wants to re-sign long-term or what. But even if they have to ship one or two of those players out, they can still get something back in. Ultimately, there is some stability there. When you talk about the Lakers, stability is far from the word I would use to describe this, because obviously it's an honor coaching that type of an organization. It's a dream to be able to coach the Los Angeles Lakers, but at the same time, you have no idea where LeBron James is going to be in 2 to 3 years. If he does leave, what's the plan with Anthony Davis? With Anthony Davis, can you trust him to be as healthy as he was this past year, played the most amount of games in his career in year 12, now headed into year 13 and his early 30s? Is he going to be, I can't imagine he's going to be more available. You have to imagine it kind of swings back in the other direction. And behind those two, I just don't know how much you really trust the rest of the roster. I do like Austin Reeves, but outside of that, it's a lot of unknowns. And ultimately, with this Lakers situation, it's very heavy pressure immediately to win, and then in a couple years, you might be thrust into a rebuild. And that's the thing, is you're just not really understanding what situation you're getting yourself into, what the both expectations both now and in the future are with that Lakers organization. Again, I feel like if the Lakers were willing to be all right with being a 6, 7, 8 seed and, being a playoff team for these last years with LeBron, it would be no big deal. But we saw Darvin Ham get fired, and he was sort of slaughtered on his way out by the media and by Lakers fans. That's clearly not enough for them. But I don't know how much more there really is for the Lakers, so I'm not trying to be a Lakers hater or anything, but I think it's a very tough position to be walking into right now, obviously outside of the prestige of it. But that is all the time we have for on that subject. So we are going to be moving on, taking a break to another big market where there are some debates as to what happened. The New York Knicks have not had much success up to this point in terms of working out a contract with forward OG Anunoby. So we are going to be diving into that next. Stick with us. We will be right back.